Welcome to the Creative Exchange webinar, A New Way Forward, How Inclusive Leadership is Driving Change. I'm hoping you can all see me because I can't see myself. The Creative Exchange webinars are presented by Creative Victoria in partnership with Arts Hub. While we're all currently in different locations, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we each live and work. Here in Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, it's a delightful, sunny, grey morning. I was saying cool before. I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all First Nations people who are joining us today. Sovereignty has never been ceded. I'm Ruth Gormley. I lead the strategic marketing team at Creative Victoria, and I will be hosting today's conversation between Katrina Sedgwick and Dewi Cook. My preferred pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman with short brown, greying hair, thick blue rimmed glasses, a black collared shirt, and a mustard coloured jumper. So, before we dive into today's conversation, there's a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar is being live captioned. If you'd like to access the captioning, just select Show Captions from your Zoom menu, or if that doesn't work, click the link in the chat. We're also recording the session, so any questions you ask will be on record. And the recorded webinar will be available through the Creative Exchange page on the Creative Victoria website, and of course on Arts Hub. Please ask any questions you have for Dewi and Katrina through the Q&A function, and we'll have about a quarter of an hour for questions at the end of the session. If you want to join in the conversation online, the hashtag for today's event are #CreativeVic and #CreativeExchange with an X, not an E. My esteemed Arts Hub colleagues will pop the proper hashtags up on the screen for you. And we plan to keep the conversation to about half an hour, allowing for 15 minutes for questions at the end. But now, the main event. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Katrina Sedgwick and Dewi Cook. Welcome, Dewi and Katrina. We've brought these two brilliant leaders together to talk about leadership because of the depth and breadth of their professional experiences. Both have had careers that have spanned multiple industries and introduced them to a range of leadership styles, allowing them to learn on the job in ways that have helped them thrive in leadership positions. Katrina has had a broad-ranging career in the creative industries. She is Director and CEO of Melbourne Arts Precinct Corporation and has previously held roles including Artistic Director of Adelaide Fringe, Head of Arts for ABC TV, and most recently, Director and CEO of ACME. Dewi comes to the creative industries with an extensive background in journalism. She is CEO of The Social Studio, a not-for-profit social enterprise providing education and work opportunities in fashion and the creative industries to people from refugee and new migrant backgrounds. So let's start the discussion. Now, Katrina and Dewi, to start off and help frame today's conversation, I thought it would be useful to reflect on how you got to where you are now. You've each had an interesting and varied career pathway to reach your current role. So what are the key lessons that you've learned along the way that have become essential to the way you lead a team? And can you point to any specific experiences that have helped you learn those lessons? Katrina, let's start with you.
Well, for me, I think I've always worked in the arts, and I was lucky enough to be raised in South Australia on Kaurna land during the premiership of Don Dunstan, which was a time of incredible investment and focus on creativity, on ideas. And so you couldn't help but feel engaged with arts and creativity and feel very empowered and included in that as a child. And it's no accident that Adelaide people from that era kind of spread like a kind of virus across Australia and the globe, engaged in all sorts of areas of the arts. I think it's a direct result of that kind of vision. But for me, I finished school and I was going to go and do a BA, but I ended up going straight into performing, and I was lucky enough to start working with a really great collective of artists who formed a group called Etc. Theatre Company, and I got to join that when I was 18, and with some really experienced practitioners. I think the oldest person in the group was a wonderful composer, the late Ian Farr, who was in his early 40s by that point. So there was a real kind of age range, and there was also a real kind of range of practice. So Julia Cotton, who convened the group, choreographer trained through the Australian Ballet School, who then kind of set out her own kind of much more contemporary practice. Russell Garbett, who incredible kind of performer, and also a illusionist. In Far, just magnificent composer. John Nelson, beautiful painter. So really kind of mixed disciplinary cohort of people. And, you know, we'd get a grant at that time. You'd get, say, $40,000 to make a show for a festival. And we would self-devise production, then present it, say, we were based in Sydney, so present it, say, Belvoir Street downstairs, and then be entrepreneurial with it, and then tour it nationally, internationally, basically live off it for the next kind of 3 or 4 years, alongside doing a whole lot of other things. So we performed in theatres, we did street performance, we performed at parties and corporate events, and, you know, so it was a very fruitful training ground. And I think far better for me personally than going and doing a BA, because what I learnt was how to work collaboratively, the value of cross-disciplinary collaboration, the value of an environment when you're making a show, it's a yes and environment, the resourcefulness that you have to apply in the independent sector and in the world of theatre, just the practical things about producing, to not just devise a show, but how do you put it on, and then what's the sort of process of touring it, and how do you contract that, and how do you deal with carnets, and just all those sorts of different skill sets, I suppose, that you had to do when you're a tiny little ensemble with no money, was just this very kind of fertile learning ground. And, you know, cut to a few years later in my sort of mid-20s, where I was, what I realised that my acting career was not going to continue. I was not going to be, you know, the next Cate Blanchett or Toni Collette or, you know, Deborah Mailman. And I had to find something else to do. I then went and worked for festivals as a producer, and I found that I was able to apply the skills that I'd learned in making theatre directly to those jobs. And really, my career has sort of continued step by step from there. So I put it all to training in the world of making theatre. And I think, you know, working in an ensemble, making work, talking about yes and being resourceful with every single cent is something that has formed the DNA of my leadership in my professional life.
Fabulous. So you really come from a background of working with, which is an unusual place to come, well, possibly. Dewi, can you speak to us about your career pathway to this leadership role?
Happy to, although, you know, I'm in the shadow of a storied arts practitioner with Katrina, having been a lowly journalist for most of my career. I was mostly at The Age. I started my cadetship at The Age, and even before my cadetship, I was there as an assistant. So really came of age at The Age, and there I covered a lot of news, as most journalists do when they first start out. So my primary patch was an area called social affairs, which was social issues, welfare issues, demographic issues, looking at multicultural communities, housing, homelessness, and that sort of thing. And so that's really where I think I first started trying to understand the diversity of the city in all of its kind of socio-economic ways. And it was such a special role to have played for so many years, because I really feel like I just had this privilege to get to know people who, just because you ask questions, they share their lives with you. And I think that is probably something that has stayed with me in terms of how I kind of approach the job still, even though I'm no longer a journalist. It's a sort of a curiosity and an empathy with individuals, and I suppose with ideas or causes. So I was a social affairs reporter for nearly 4 years, and then I moved across into a few different areas. I covered city issues, which again is super interesting, a different side of Melbourne. It's really looking at planning and development and the intersections there with, you know, again with housing, and how a city sees itself and how it grows and how it responds to the needs of its citizenry. I covered the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, which was obviously a momentous historical event, and my shorthand became very, very good. And then I moved into arts reporting. And I can really say that arts reporting and social affairs reporting and the intersection between those two are the two areas that I draw most on in my work as a social studio. So in the arts, I found, I guess, a community or a world that was just filled with beauty, and not always beauty in an aesthetic sense, but a real pursuit of what makes life beautiful to people. And so I saw that across many different disciplines, and I think that now when I work at the social studio, like I said, it's that sort of intersection between what makes a city tick, what are the issues that are important to people, what are the issues that we don't hear about as well, and how can we, using visual communication or creative pursuits, tell the story of that. So in that sense, I feel like that's really defined what I do as a leader, and I'm on a much kind of earlier part of my trajectory with that than Katrina is. I've only been at the social studio a couple of years, but I can say that in my time as a journalist, I also I had to learn from being a journalist, where you're sort of a bit of a lone wolf and you get to do your things on your own, to having to work collaboratively. And even though I would say like newsrooms are collegiate, I can probably point to a couple of really influential leaders in my time there who editors that I had the benefit of working under. Debbie Cuthbertson, who's now Sunday Age editor. She and I were a dynamic arts duo together, and she was my arts editor while I was deputy editor. And I just think that there's something about having people that can nurture you and people that can can see your talent and see your ability and give you a shot. And Debbie was one of those people. Farah Farouk, who's actually the board chair of the social studio, who was my social affairs editor in my early days. She's another one of those people. They are people who will remember your name 15 years down the track, 20 years down the track. And I think it's that sort of approach to being really human that really resonates with me, and it makes me want to be that kind of leader as well.
That's you've spoken, Dairy, about people who've nurtured you. To flip that round, what sort of strategies and approaches do you use to identify and foster the development of emerging leaders in your organisation and in the community that you've mentioned?
Yeah, so I think that, again, one of the skills I think I learned as a journalist is to, you have to try to get people to take you into their trust quite quickly, because you're obviously asking, sometimes personal questions of them, or asking them to appear in the newspaper, to tell their stories, that sort of thing. And I think that that's the sort of basis from which all of my relationships are built at the studio or beyond, is really trying to understand who my staff are as people, what motivates them, what their lives are like when they're not at work as well, and what are the things that they have to juggle, because the truth is that everybody's lives are complex, but in particularly, with some of the communities that we work with, life is even more complex. There's many family, cultural, religious, sometimes responsibilities that people are having to integrate, I suppose, into the rest of their lives. And so understanding kind of where their priorities lie is really important. As far as how I nurture or look for leaders. So something that I do is I get approached a lot when we are advertising for jobs or even for volunteers, and I keep every one of those CVs on hand, and they are the people that I always go back to first if I ever have an opportunity, because what I find is that quite often I'm interviewing people who are have a lot of potential, who are really great, who maybe are just not quite right for that one role. And and yet I don't want to let them go. And so I try to keep in touch with some people that I think are particularly high potential, or I'm also sort of seeding their CVs to people that I know in the sector or beyond, because I think one of the nice things about getting to the sort of stage of life that I'm at, and after sort of almost a couple of decades now of working, is you know, you can start to realize that you know a lot of people, and you know a lot of people of influence. And I think that one of the main philosophies that I really had is to try to turn over all that inherent networking and opportunity that many of us grow up with or have access to, and turn that over to people that don't have access to that as easily because of, you know, where they grew up or how they grew up or how they've been defined or whatever. So something that, that I'm regularly doing, and I am being asked a lot. Like I got asked this week if I could recommend somebody for an EA position, and you know, it's that sort of thing that I just I try to spread the love, I suppose. And I also internally work with a lot of really exceptional, almost entirely young women who really need somebody to believe in them and to give them the opportunities to just stretch themselves a little bit. And I find that, like I've had, you know, having an older, shall I say, woman believe in me, or having elder women believe in me, has really made me take a leap. And I want other people to feel that they can too.
Thank you. And what about you, Katrina? Do you find that you are using similar tactics today for growing and identifying and fostering leaders, or are there other things that spring to mind for you for developing emerging leaders?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm just sort of nodding as you're talking, Dewi. And I think that's absolutely right. And that kind of, I think what you're talking about too is sort of leading with, you know, a kind of generosity, I suppose, and a sort of flatter, more ensemble approach to working collaboratively rather than something too hierarchical. And I think that's quite important in leadership, to be open, to be able to talk to people across the organisation, to encourage ideas, but also to be frank and be clear when that's not the direction you want to take it, and explain why. You know, I think feedback is really important, but encouragement, you know, I think when I look at the sort of work I've done in my career, what's been really lucky for me is I've been given opportunities to kind of do something quite different in each job, or sort of I've been allowed to sort of stretch, you know, I go into a position, then I'm allowed to sort of adapt and stretch that. So for example, going into the ABC, and I was sort of head of arts for ABC Television, which was a new role. It was previously sort of entertainment, comedy and arts, and then it became entertainment and arts. And then when I took over, it was just arts. And it was sort of clear that it was a bit of an obligation rather than a pleasure in the context of TV, and that, you know, it didn't necessarily get great ratings, and you know, it was sort of complex to do, and it wasn't the sort of necessarily the sort of show pony moments. And anyway, kind of coming in, I just really thought what was so amazing about working at the ABC, it's a multi-platform broadcaster. You know, it's not just TV, it's TV and radio and online and all of those things, and of course digital just going crazy across so many different devices. This is sort of back in 2012, as everything was sort of shifting and becoming much more sort of multi-channel and personal device based. And having worked in the arts, you know, recognizing that when you do a festival, for example, you've got to talk to like 5 different people at the ABC to get all your coverage, and you know, you've got all this sea of logos, you know, of ABC logos. And so we decided to think more holistically about the arts on the ABC, and think about it as a multi-platform offer, and, you know, which was a bit kind of, you know, had never been done before and sort of wasn't really my business, but it was really interesting, you know. And so we all kind of got together and formed a group and worked out, you know, and set up a logo for ABC Arts and worked all this stuff. That kind of, you know, it was very positive, and it enabled the ABC to measure the fact that in fact they reached 2 million people a week through their arts coverage, which is huge. And, you know, I think supporting people when they're working for you to have ideas that aren't in the box. Just because your job description says X, Y, Z, you know, you're a coordinator of X, you know, or you're an assistant of Y. If you're enthusiastic and excited about the place that you work and the purpose that your organisation is trying to deliver, and you see something that could be really interesting, a new way of thinking, a lateral kind of approach, a kind of partnership that could bring, you know, new rewards, or an experiment or a risk that you could take that may fail but also could result in something fantastic. To be in an environment where you can express that and get some time and resource, and if required money carved out to be able to support that, is really important. And I think that's how people can blossom. You don't just have to stay, it's not the factory that we're working in. You know, there's not a single function that you're delivering. Any element of the arts sings best when people feel energized to be able to use their imagination and to be able to contribute, whether there's somebody working in finance, or somebody who's a performer, or somebody who's a programmer, or a producer, or a policymaker, whatever that is. And I think, you know, I am seeking to create, I don't think I always do by any means, it's a hard thing to do, but I think it's important to try and foster an environment where people can have that. It's not necessarily about autonomy. It's not about people just being able to do whatever they want. It's about fostering a sense of collective purpose and momentum, and then enabling people to be able to express their ideas, and then when it really works, resource it. And that is how people develop. And that is how they discover new things about themselves, build new skills, and move to that next stage in their careers, I think.
So sorry, I was going to ask Katrina whether you feel like you were more able to do that at a smaller scale in smaller organizations than at the bigger end, or vice versa. Like, does having money and having budget and stuff allow you to be able to do that, or is it less about resourcing and more about intention?
I think it's more about intention, because you know, everywhere that I've worked in my career, I've been surrounded by people doing exactly that, and I've been working on minuscule budgets through to now massive budgets. And I think what I find is the more kind of resource you get, I mean, you're working generally with more people, and the larger the organisation is, I suppose, the harder it is to foster that culture. I mean, I had a big shock of going from a core team of about 8 at the film festival where I worked for a decade, to then going into the ABC, where you're in this gigantic bureaucratic machine. But, you know, the rules are still the same. The individual can affect change. I suppose it's just being confident enough to knock on the door and say, hello, I was just thinking this. And I suppose then when you're in a larger organisation, encouraging people to be able to do that. So, you know, somebody in your facilities team, for example, you know, Fed Square is part of what we do. You know, how do you encourage somebody who works in the facilities team to be able to come and talk to their manager, or to their executive, or to me, or to somebody else about a concept or a different way of working? And, you know, that's harder to kind of embed in a large organisation than in something small where you've got a tiny team and you're all in a room together and you're talking all the time. You know, that's why I like being in the office. That's why I don't really like working from home, because I really like being near people where you can just throw things out, and, you know. And I have to say too, the feedback I do get is that I am a little bit annoying, because I have lots of ideas and I keep wanting to have those conversations. And of course, when you're in a big bureaucracy and do that, it has a different effect than when you're in a small organisation. So I have to be quite, you know, a bit more disciplined about that kind of stuff. But I think in the end, it's the intention. It's coming in with energy and optimism and purpose, and knowing that you can come in at a very junior level with that purpose and have impact. And that's how you progress into leadership, I think, which requires the leaders to let you do that.
Yeah, I was thinking about this because when I first started at the studio, so the studio, for those that don't know, we're a not-for-profit social enterprise. Our primary purpose is education and training, and we have a free school that provides certified training, RMIT certified training in clothing and textile production. So we have a school, and then we have a manufacturing studio with makers and garment machinists, and we make clothes for ourselves, but also mostly for third parties. And we have kind of retail, creative, admin as a sort of third, I guess, part of the organization. And really what I kind of realized when I got there was that there was, in part because of the pandemic and all the dislocation that had happened in that first year of COVID, that there wasn't a lot of flow between or connection between school, manufacturing, retail, and also because the jobs were so different. And I think that that's something, that you have to kind of come to figure out how to meld together when, for example, our garment machinists, they work a shift, basically. They work from 9 till 5. They've got their set tea breaks. They are doing something very kind of focused, quite manual a lot of the time, as opposed to creative, who are like, we just have meetings and we talk about stuff, we throw ideas around, and, a lot of that is kind of done walking around with a coffee or whatever. And then you've got school, who are kind of having to respond day to day to the changing nature of the classroom, and there are very different personality types, different kind of tasks, within the day, and really people often from different walks of life as well. And so I was like, how do we bring this group of people? Whereas, in a sort of a newsroom environment that I'd been in, even though people's personalities were wildly different, we were all kind of engaging in the same work, in effect. But this was a space that had multiple different kinds of work disciplines. And so I feel like for me, one of the things that I've tried to do over the time is really try to create pathways. So having opportunities for students from the school to work in manufacturing, having opportunities for manufacturing to get involved in creative projects. And then, it's not rocket science, I would say, but like we've just tried to do something very simple, and just to have lunch together. So we have at the moment sort of fairly regular community lunches where we all bring in food, and students as well, and I'm really surprised. Obviously that can't work in a huge organization with huge teams, or maybe it can, but I'm really surprised how and again, maybe it kind of goes back to those ideas that I hold dear to myself, about human connection and about taking the time to get to know each other, because the fact is, like, unless you're working in the manufacturing team, or you're working in the school, or you're working in the shop downstairs, you're not really getting a sense of who the people are that you're working alongside of, even though you're sharing the same space. So I don't know whether that's something that you guys have thought about as well. Not so much lunch, Katrina, but I imagine, when you were coming up as a practitioner, you were working alongside people of varying different disciplines as well, even within the performing arts, and how you figured out a way to create that sense of community.
Yeah, and it is so important. And again, obviously, if you're working in a theatre company where it's just 6 of you, that's fostered very kind of easily. And again, in a festival environment, it's such a kind of tight group that sort of is heading towards this kind of critical mass moment, and then it all finishes and everyone feels the anticlimax together, and and then you start again. And how you foster that in a larger organization is much more challenging and equally important. We used to do at the ABC, we used to do bake-offs, highly competitive bake-offs, which were really fun, just to try and bring people together, from different departments. We were all sharing a floor, but, you had arts, and then you had media watch, and then you had, entertainment and kitchen cabinet, and, the chaser down the hall. And, how do you get everyone to kind of share a moment, I suppose, every few months? So through competitive baking, of course, is the way to do it. But I think you're right. That sort of human connection is really important. And then the thing that I've found in these kind of larger organisations, and it was equally the case in certainly a festival environment, getting your systems right, so that, it's so jargonistic, but silos are real, and lack of communication between teams is real, and different systems being deployed by different teams which actually block and slow down and stifle efficiency and stifle collaboration. Those systems exist in every organisation, and coming in and taking time and having the care as a leader to pay attention to that stuff and make it a priority, and not just accept because it's always been done this way that it has to be done this way. Actually really push people to go, how are you actually doing your job? How are you actually communicating with these people? And, we do these things. We're just about to have one at MAPCO actually, where you get a whole lot of teams and you just get post-it notes and you just talk about, okay, if we're putting on an event, how do you actually do that? We did that at ACME around what is the journey of a film in this organisation. And in doing that, we discovered that at one point there was one staff member who was entering data into 8 different systems for a single film. Crazy, and it just had built up over 18 years that all these different parts of the organisation were operating in a slightly different way. That meant that there was a huge amount of time spent doing these things. And I think you can't underestimate how important that is. Like, you've got to give your team the right tools, and you've got to be open and transparent about the work that each individual is doing towards the shared purpose. And you've got to make sure that that's actually working for everybody, and that it's conjoined and it's enabling easy collaboration, transparency, efficiency, in terms of not about reducing staff headcount, about people not wasting their time doing double entry of things, messing about trying to find information about something that's really crucial that they need right now. But it's been entered into a different set. I know it sounds really tedious, but it's so important. And the larger the organisation, the more amplified that is.
Yeah, and I think I've sorry.
I'm just going to say we should think about questions very soon, but you keep discussing.
No worries. I just was going to say
something
quickly, because I feel like when we talked about this, Katrina, I asked you once whether you were a very structured leader, and we both kind of agreed that both of us were sort of maybe a little bit anti-structure, or at least I am, I'm not one of those people that like maps out my day, but I have come to realize is that, especially within a small organization, even sharing a single space, that just talking to each other all the time doesn't mean that you're always communicating, if that makes sense. That you need to, there's a reason why, WIPs exist, and why you can have like a daily or a weekly check-in, is to have those really structured conversations to try to like get through stuff that aren't all problem solving, brainstorming, blue skies thinking, that are really just what are our priorities and how are we going to get through them. And so that's definitely like my learning journey, is to as somebody who loves a bit of a chat and loves to just kind of check in on people and wander past, it's not that the message isn't always getting across, or like not everybody understands what is happening within the organization just because it's all in my head. Does that make sense?
Totally. And I was just going to say too, as part of that, having a board, reporting to a board, I find actually such a good discipline, because I like working with boards where you as you have an idea at its most kind of nascent form, to explain it to a board so that they're coming on the journey, and you've got to be really succinct. They're reading a lot of stuff, they're busy people, you've got to kind of be punchy with it, taking the time to write it down, this idea that you've been happily chatting about, in the office, but to actually distill it into something that makes sense for somebody who has no context for it, who's got a busy day, who doesn't work in the field. You want them to read about it and get excited and go, yep, we should do this, is such a good discipline. And I just find then you've got this thing written down that you then go back to, and you go back to as you're developing it for a grant application or for your web copy and your marketing copy, or for your acquittal or whatever it is. It's just really, really useful. And to do that at an early stage also really helps bring your team on the journey, because they're, you know, seeing it in writing, not just in my head, and me thinking I'm explaining it incredibly articulately as we have a cup
It all
of tea.
makes sense in my head, but
Totally.
I think this, what we've just been talking about, the mixture of the structure of discipline and whips and boards, compared with the culture of openness, collaboration, yes, and that you've both spoken about. We've had a question saying, how do you get past leaders not feeling threatened by both inexperienced, inspiring ideas offered by young and experienced, informed ideas offered by the more mature, and how to balance them, particularly given that some of those people may come from different cultures. So they've spoken of someone with experience obtained outside Australia. And how do you deal with the tall poppy syndrome that appears in a lot of organizations?
That's tricky.
yeah, I mean, I think it's it kind of reminds me, I suppose, of what we were talking about, that sort of the lean towards generosity, because actually it doesn't really exist a lot of the time. And I think that's probably why Katrina and I both like to offer generosity in the kind of people that we are introducing into leadership or offering or pushing into new roles, because in my experience, you know, that's not the case across the board. And I think that the issue around skills and knowledge acquired overseas is very, very difficult. I mean, I've had the experience of interviewing many people whose professional careers were very different overseas than what they've come to me in a job for. And I don't know. I will give an example. A few years ago, I interviewed for a kind of a support role, an admin role, and somebody that came to me was a very, very experienced doctor from Afghanistan who had done a little bit of work in kind of community health since being in Australia, but was more or less out of work. And that is a very difficult thing, because, you know, what I was looking for is obviously a specific set of skills around like social support for young people, and they didn't quite fit that bill. But I think that what I tried to do in that instance was give them a few different options of people that I could connect them to, or pathways that they could explore to maybe get them to closer to the sort of role that they were looking for, which I know is different than having a more mature leader or a leader from overseas within the organization. But I would say that if that's you, or if that's somebody that you know, is to always find the Katrina in your organization that has that generous spirit that will take you under and give you the opportunity to explore the idea, because those people are within every organization. It just may not be the defining culture of the organization.
Yeah, and I think you know, as a leader, you need to listen not just to the noisy people. You've got to make sure that you're setting up situations where people who are quiet and shy, who don't have English as their first language, who are, you know, not used to working in, you know, large, confident groups of people. You've got to find ways and make sure that those people get a chance to speak and be heard and get to connect with you, as well as the kind of confident, brash, noisy people who are much more naturally comfortable, possibly because they've always been invited to do it, to put themselves forward. And I think that's hugely important. But I think, you know, and I'll, you know, just as somebody who's, you know, I notice, for example, in environments that if we're just down to the straight binary male, female dynamic that women will tend to sit back and say less and put themselves forward less for roles and for opportunities and to pitch ideas. So making sure that you've got an environment that is aware of that reluctance. That's one example. There's so many examples. And I think the other thing is, if you are a junior person, you know, you can worry about being, yeah, do I know enough? Am I experienced enough to have this idea to express this thing? Well, you know, maybe you are inexperienced, but it's still a good idea. So what is the best way to do that? And I suppose it is really think about what the concept is, take the time to write it down and be clear. So you're not just pitching it in as casual conversation, but you've actually got it clearly stated, and talk to your manager, and if the manager's not interested, go around them to somebody else, not in a way that's overtly undermining, but you know, take the time to if you think it's a great idea, work out who wants to listen and see if it gets purchased. You know, that's all you need. You just need a hook in somewhere. So, you know, be lateral about who you're talking to, you know, and don't sit back and wait, and, you know, don't not apply for the job because you think you don't have the experience.
Fantastic. We've got 3 minutes left in our official time, so I'm going to ask a snappy question. But if you are both able to stick around for a little bit for a little further conversation, then anyone who wishes to remain with us is welcome to do so. I'll tie us off at about 5 to 12, if that's all right with you two.
Sure.
Great. So the snappy question is: leadership a title we claim or a gift from those around us from your perspective? And that's from Virginia Aldred.
I'll go first. I think it's got to be from people around you. Otherwise, you don't get the gigs.
What about you, Dewi?
Yeah, I think that look, you can definitely not anybody, but you can go for a job that calls you a leader, but unless you're successfully leading a team and you've got buy-in from the team and are able to inspire that team, then you're probably not really fulfilling the role as a leader. So in that sense, I think it's definitely a gift.
Which does lead us quite neatly into, can you speak to the nebulous notion of inclusivity in leadership? How do you integrate it into your practices and make inclusion, which includes leadership, more than a token gesture?
Yep, I can go with that. So that's something we think about a lot at the studio. And I think something Katrina and I also, we've spoken about before, that the sort of the job of leading you never really kind of get it. It never ends, I suppose. You're always having to work and improve. And, you know, for us, obviously, we look to have a very diverse workforce. So 70% of our employees are from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and 40% are from refugee and asylum seeking backgrounds. And so there is inclusivity in a kind of literal sense, you know, stats and numbers, but then also really looking at, in my view, like, I think language is really important, and that's probably a job that it's a bigger piece of work that we're considering, is how do we describe the work we do in a way that speaks to the people we work with, for, alongside, because, you know, I think it's very easy to just be rigid around definitions of people, so refugee, asylum seeker, whatever, but actually in terms of the identity of many of our staff and participants and community members, they would identify more closely with being person of Somali heritage than they would a person of refugee heritage. So for us, I think that that's an ongoing conversation. It's one that we're having currently, and that is sort of played out through a lot of consultation and a lot of conversation to try to maintain currency, I suppose, because I think language in particular has changed and changes so much at the moment, to try to keep up to date with those terms. So in terms of inclusivity, from a kind of cultural, multicultural, whatever you want to call it, perspective, that's what we're really looking at.
Is there anything you'd like to add around inclusivity?
I suppose just the frame for the kinds of, certainly at ACME and again now at MAPCO, where we're looking at, obviously a kind of capital project. We're operating Fed Square, and then we're thinking about how we kind of glue together the arts precinct more broadly. There's so many different layers if you're talking about inclusivity and sort of equality of engagement and access, and they relate to content, what you're presenting, the kind of diversity of program, design. It comes down to, within the built form and the sort of design process. There's also staff cohort, and then there's also audience. Who is coming, who is engaging, who feels ownership of these places and spaces. And when we talk about programming, we talk about programming and interpretation, which is whose stories are being heard, how are we acknowledging this place, this space, this land, who, so there's so many kind of layers to it. It's not one thing. And, it's really important that an organisation understands that and is continually committing resource and time to address all of those multiple dimensions of that. They all require attention, which is staff time. They all require resource, that is time and money. And they all are longevity, that it's continuous. It's exactly as Dewi says, continuous improvement. You're never going to get there. So,
and I think that it probably, requires an acceptance of a few uncomfortable conversations, or an ability to have an uncomfortable conversation and then move forward, and not just like get stuck in what you've done wrong or how you haven't met certain needs, but think about what your solutions can be or what your strategies can be for the future.
Fantastic. I think we have time for one more if we both answer very quickly. A couple of people have asked around challenges to your leadership. So it would be great to hear from you if there's been times where you found in your journey where you found yourself up against significant roadblocks, and how did you manage that? Were there people you turned to for advice or support in those moments? Would you have preferred to have a master's degree in arts management to get you through? Challenges and ways through them in a minute each.
I will just briefly say that I feel like the biggest challenge that I experience on a daily basis is resourcing and funding. And so that is definitely something for anybody considering entering the world of kind of arts management, especially at the small scale, where funding isn't guaranteed, is one, like figuring out a way to wear that weight, because I feel like there's a lot of weight on a leader, especially if you've got employees and you're responsible for their livelihoods. So a way to process that and not just hold on to the stress, because you need to be able to be proactive. And yes, definitely having sounding board, a brains trust that you can talk to, whether that's a mentor or a group of people. I'm very lucky that I've also got a few fellow sort of CEOs of small organizations who have helped me out in recent kind of time, thinking about things to do with strategy, because strategy is always tied with money. So, drawing on your peer group, I think, is really great. And having a peer group in general, who aren't your board, who aren't the people that you're having to report to, but people that you can be really honest with, is something that's essential.
Brilliant, thank you. And Katrina?
I totally agree, 100%. I mean, peers, the kind of friends and colleagues in the sort of arts are my rock. And, I turn to people a lot to ask for advice, and, to be able to download and so on. I had a friend who sent me a few years ago a book saying it's one of those kind of, you know, management-y books, but sent me something about having the courage to be disliked. And I read about 10 pages because I don't love management-y books, but I think the point that she was making is true. I think you do, as a leader, have to accept that the responsibility of leadership is that you are sometimes making decisions that are tough, that aren't going to please everybody. And it's not appropriate for you to go and complain about people complaining about that to other people in the organization. You've got to suck it up, you know, and you've got to do what's right for whatever elements you've made that decision for, you know, whatever outcome you've made that decision for. And you can't please everybody all of the time. And that's hard. And, you know, there will be people you work with who don't like the way you work. You know, Davey's the same. I'm not a big, having talked about process and systems, I'm not a big process and system person. I'm a much more organic person. And that I've had times where I've worked with colleagues who it just drove them crazy, absolutely crazy. And ultimately they left, but quite a lot of pain ensued before they did, you know. And you just have to stick to your guns and be courageous and accept that not everyone is going to like what you think, and you've got to be consultative and you've got to listen and you've got to take people on the journey, but sometimes you just got to make a decision, and that's hard.
Yeah, it can be a bit lonely, which is why having those people to call on. And I think, you know, to that, I think one of the elements of that question was about an arts administration degree or something like that. And I don't come from that background at all, but you know, Katrina might have a view, but I think that like as much practical experience as you can get to sort of see the different levels of what an arts organization can be, because what I do is wildly different. Like the scale that I work on is so different from the scale that Katrina works on. Do you know what I mean? But then there are kind of common probably issues and themes which crop up. And I think understanding like the funding landscape for arts of all kinds is really important. And the intersections between like, you know, what is achievable, what can be achieved versus like ambition versus how you get money and what that cycle looks like is really, because, you know, most arts organizations do rely on funding of some kind. And then, but I would say that, you know, whether it's a full degree or other training you can do, but on a very basic level, you know, project management skills, reading a profit and loss statement, understanding kind of fiduciary obligations, that sort of thing is super important. And you can learn that on the job, but it's probably good to have those skills before you start the job if you're taking on a bigger role.
Thank you both. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Pulling out from what you both just said, I find you both courageous, consultative, and clear-eyed, and I really appreciate the time you've given us today. So yeah, huge thanks from me, from Creative Victoria, from Arts Hub, and from everybody who's watching. I'm now going to pass over to Madeline Swain from Arts Hub for the last couple of words, but from the bottom of my heart, I've learned a lot today. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. As Ruth said, thank you, Ruth. I'm Madeline Swain. I'm the managing editor at Arts Hub, and we are co-producing these webinars with Creative Vic under the Creative Exchange umbrella. I'd also like to add my thanks to Katrina and Dewi for their insights today and sharing their expertise and their experiences with us. I've learned a lot as well. And I'd like to remind everybody listening and watching that this webinar has been videoed and will be available on the Arts Hub website shortly. There will also be a couple of follow-up podcasts to both this webinar and our previous one launched shortly, so look out for those. And also please keep an eye out for our next webinar in this series, which will be in late July, and we'll delve into the hot topic of AI and its implications for the arts and cultural sector, which everybody is talking about at the moment. And look out for those hashtags, use those hashtags, Creative Vic, hashtag Creative Vic, and hashtag Creative Exchange, capital X, I've put that in the chat. And we hope to see you all at the next time. Thanks for joining us today.